Hello, everyone, and thank you again for holding. And no, thank you all for joining our webinar. I'm joined with our technical account manager, Daniel Francis Lyon. Daniel.
Yeah, hello. Thank you all for attending. I'm Daniel, and we're here to talk about Container Station. It's our application to let you deploy Docker containers on a QNAP NAS. And this could be a very powerful tool because right now there are somewhere close to 100 applications that you can run on your QNAP, but there are there's many thousands of containers that are available that could be run in a QNAP. Just a moment, let me turn down my volume. So yeah, there's many containers that you can run in a QNAP. So this lets you do a lot more. So yeah, without further ado, let's go into it. So what is a container? We can think of a container as being like an application, except that its dependencies are containerized in the application. It's an application that carries its dependencies with it so that it does not have to grab those dependencies from the host system. So that makes it, in some ways, very similar to a virtual machine. So a container is a lightweight, standalone, executable software package that includes everything you need to run the specific application, code, runtime, system tools, library settings. In other words, it carries its dependencies with it. It can grab the dependencies from itself rather than from the host. But a difference between a container and a typical virtual machine is containers share the host OS kernel. And that means they take many less resources than a typical VM, because in a typical VM, you have to run a hypervisor and then run a different kernel on top of that hypervisor. But a container, it can all use the same host kernel, but it still has most of the isolation of VM would typically have. So it has it isolates processes by using namespaces and cog groups, which separate system resources such as networks. So containers have their own IP addresses, process IDs, file system views, and memory. So it has most of the isolation of a full VM, but takes much less resources than a full VM. So comparing a normal app to a container, I want to kind of put this in more layman's terms. So I would say that a container is a lot like a backpacker because it carries its dependencies with it. So you think of a backpacker, what do you depend on? You depend on shelter. Well, backpackers carry their tent with them. They carry their sleeping bag with them. They carry their food with them, a stove to cook their food. Backpackers carry what they depend on with them, and containers carry the dependencies with them. So a standard app that's not a container, that would be much like just a person who maybe is on a road trip going from Marriott to Marriott. He's not carrying his bed. He's not carrying his shelter. He depends on the Marriott to give him breakfast in the morning. He is not carrying his dependencies. He has to access those dependencies from where he is hosted, in this case, a Marriott. And usually that can work fine. But the issue is what happens when you go from one operating system to the other operating system. Well, the way an application is programmed to access the dependencies on one operating system may not work on another operating system. On another operating system, those dependencies could be accessed slightly differently. And then what happens is it may not effectively get those dependencies. So the analogy here is this traveler who depends on the Marriott, the way he gets his needs met is he goes to the Marriott, walks up to the front desk, hands the Marriott card and says, I want a room. And that works fine as long as he's in the land of Marriott. But when you go to a different operating system, it's kind of like you're going from the land of Marriott to the land of Hyatt. So he now goes to the different operating system. So now he goes to the land of Hyatt. He goes to the Hyatt. He tries to get his needs met the way he always has. He walks right up to the front desk, hands over his Marriott card and says, please give me a room. But now there's a problem. The people at the Hyatt say, we don't take your Marriott card. Your Marriott card is good at the Marriott. It's not good at the Hyatt. So now the way he's always accessed what he depends on, the way he's always accessed his shelter he depends on, all of a sudden doesn't work. And that's the problem with moving an application from one operating system to the other operating system. But now for the container analogy of the backpacker, you can see he's walking. There's a Hyatt in the background, but do you think he cares that that's a Hyatt? Like, do you think he'll care if that's a Hyatt or a Marriott or a Hotel 6? Like, it really doesn't matter because he doesn't need the Hyatt or a Marriott or Hotel 6. he carries the food and shelter he depends on with him. So containers move from operating system to operating system just fine, and they don't really have a problem. So that's why there's so many containers that would be compatible with QNAP NAST. Right now, if it's a normal application, you really need to use an application that's been programmed and designed for QNAP. But when using containers, you're not limited to just containers that were designed for QNAP. Just about any container that was designed for Linux should work on the QNAP. It should work on Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, QNAP, just about anything Linux-based. And by the way, on Windows, you can install the Docker Desktop app, and then it does virtualize Linux kernel, and then you can run Docker containers on your Windows computer using Docker Desktop. You can run Docker Desktop on Mac. There's something new in the news recently of an even more efficient way to run the Linux kernel on Mac. So Docker containers can be run on almost anything these days. So the other advantage of containers besides compatibility is isolation. First of all, are there any questions so far? So I'll just keep going. So another advantage of containers is isolation. So because containers don't need to grab dependencies from the host, you can isolate them a lot more, right? Like if you think of this app, it has to grab its dependencies from the host. Because it has to grab dependencies, you can't really cut it. You can't really isolate it from the host if it constantly has to grab dependencies. So the issue with an app is, what if an app gets infected with a virus? If it can't be as isolated from the host, if the app gets infected, there's a higher chance it could spread that infection to the host. But for a container, it's grabbing dependencies from itself, so it doesn't need to grab that from the host. You can just cut it off, isolate it from the host to a much greater degree. So if this container gets infected, the infection should stay inside the container, whereas if an app gets infected, there's a greater possibility of it spreading to the host. So to go to my backpacker analogy versus, traveler going to the Marriott analogy, if the backpacker gets infected, he can just be by himself, not infecting anybody else. But if the traveler at the Marriott gets infected, if he gets infected by a virus and then stays at the Marriott, there is some chance that what if he spreads the infection to other people at the Marriott? So this is a big advantage of containers. It's not just compatibility, it's isolation. Allows for a much higher degree of security. So why might you run a container? Well, reason one is we don't have an app for it, so you run a container for it. But reason two is you want a higher degree of security through higher degree of isolation. So in Container Station, there's two main ways to deploy a container. You could use YAML. So you go to Container Station, click Application, click Create, and there's a place to paste your YAML. Or two, you can use the Container Station GUI, where the ports show up and you just put the ports there, but they show up. And through our GUI, you can also add NAS folders. So I'll be demonstrating both today. So to get started, I want to mention that a lot of times YAML is easier because a lot of times the official provider of a container will actually give you the YAML. So here's a picture of Nextcloud. If you go to Nextcloud Docker Hub, not only do they provide the container, they provide this YAML. So almost everything you need to deploy the YAML is here. And with some relatively minor changes, you can get this working in the NAS. So first obvious change, you see they did not put a MySQL password. So you have to write a password here. You have to copy the password there and put a password there. So just make a password. The other thing is port 8080 is already taken by your NAS, most likely. So you have to change this port. But if you put the password, change the port, then the rest you can just copy and paste, and this should just work on your QNAP. And I'll go over this. I'm going to make a few more changes as well. But just a few things I want to mention is sometimes the YAML people provide will include an absolute path. And when there's an absolute path in the provided YAML, that almost always has to change on your QNAP, because what an absolute path is, it's a path to a specific folder. And whoever gave, if the official provider of a container provided YAML, they probably don't know the official folder path to your particular QNAP. So the absolute path they put is probably not the right absolute path. So when official YAML from official container provider has an absolute path, you almost always have to change it. So you typically SSH into your QNAP to get the absolute path to the folder you want to go to. So how do you recognize absolute path? Well, an absolute path starts with //. So here's an example of how it looks on my QNAP. This is how I have Nextcloud running on the Next2 share folder, but the absolute path to it is share. It's in ZFS 19 on my QNAP. It may not be ZFS 19 on your QNAP. So this really does need to be checked and verified, but on my QNAP, there's for share. Inside share, there's ZFS 19. Inside ZFS 19, there's share folder next 2. And then I had it create a data folder inside next 2. So absolute path starts with //. Relative path starts with // So relative path is, rather than start at root, starts at the relative to where your YAML is deployed. And by default, that would be your container folder. And then just a hyphen without a slash is an internal volume. So see this one, this is internal volume. So when the YAML provided is internal volume, you typically do not need to change internal volumes. Now you might want to. I actually decided for my Nextcloud, I want to change it, but it's optional. Internal volumes, you don't have to modify. You could just copy paste as it is and it should work. Relative paths, you don't have to change, but you might want to. Okay. And absolute paths, you really need to change. And if you have the wrong absolute path, you could actually cause your NAS to temporarily stop working until tech support helps. So you don't want to mess up an absolute path. So let me just give you an example of how you could screw up an absolute path. So first of all, I need to understand that / means root. That is your system directory. So if I have this share, what this means is I start in my root system directory where I don't want to write. If I write to my system directory, I could temporarily mess up my NAS until tech support can help. So start at root system directory, then it will look for a folder called share. When it finds share, it will then look for a folder called ZFS 19 data. When it finds this, it will look for a folder called next2, which I've already set up. And then when it got to next2, it looks for data but did not find data. And then it created a folder called data. And that's exactly what I wanted. But let's imagine I spelled share wrong. What if I spell share SHAIR? Have a typo, have a misspelling, whatever. What does it do? It goes to system directory root, looks for a folder called SHAIR. It fails to find SHAIR. So what does it do? It creates a folder called SHAIR. It creates this folder in my system directory exactly where I don't want to write anything. Then it creates a folder called ZFS 19 in my share, SHAIR folder. It made in my system directory. It makes a folder called next2 inside that. It makes a folder called data inside of that. So my container is probably still going to work, but everything my container writes now, it will write to my system directory. The more you write to the system directory, the slower and more sluggish your NAS gets until eventually it might just stop working until tech support can SSH in and remove folder SHAIR from your system directory. So you do not want to screw up an absolute path. You want to be very careful, get the right path. If you screw it up, you will likely need tech support to fix this. And the other thing that you usually need to change in the YAML provided by those who provide YAML from official container providers is the port. So on the left, where it says 8080, that is the external port. On the right, 80 in this case is the internal port, the container internal port. Internal ports you should not change. Try to change them, it just typically just doesn't work. But the external port can be almost anything. What this means is when you externally enter a port, it then forwards it to port 80. So I could change this to 8081, I could change this to 8888, I could change this to almost anything. Whatever port I put here forwards the port here. If you want to understand this, this is a very similar concept to port forwarding. Like We don't recommend doing this anymore because it's not safe, but back in the day, I don't know if you can remember forwarding ports in your router. People might say, I know forward port 880. So whenever anyone types in my global IP address in 880, forward it to my NAS IP. So you used to do forwarding tables on your router. This is a very similar concept, but we don't recommend forwarding tables on your router anymore because it's really not secure. But if anyone can remember back in the day when more people used to do that, this is similar in concept. This port is forwarding to the container internal port. Another thing that's optional change is PUID and PGID. This is an optional thing you can add to your YAML for added security. PUID is user ID, and then this is group ID. So when you make a user like Tom, maybe he'll be part of user group everyone, or you can make someone part of administrators. So you can add a user and a group. And this has an extra layer of security because when you make a container, they're isolated by default. They typically only have access to the specific folders you map onto it. But what this does is you could also make a user that only has access to that one folder. And that way, if the container was compromised and hacked, there's still Docker isolation. But let's say they managed to hack a vulnerability in Docker itself. Well, that's the container still running as a user that only has access to that one folder. So now if you use PUID, PGID to compromise your host, they have to first hack the container, then they have to hack Docker, and then they would also have to hack user isolation. And that is so extremely hard to do that basically have like 3 layers of security they would have to hack their way through to mess up your host. So this just adds another layer of security. So maybe now I could answer a couple questions. So what can I do with a container that is more beneficial to just sticking with an app? It depends what it is. A lot of times containers are the same thing as apps. They just have a higher degree of isolation and a higher degree of security. So a lot of times you're doing the same thing. Like right now, you could run Tailscale app or you could run Tailscale container. So there are a number of times when you can just run the container or the app. But when you can do more things, it's what happens when there's no app. Like right now, I think Tailscale is great, but it's free for personal use, but has a cost for professional use. But with containers, you can run a twin-gate container, does most of the same thing. But my understanding is they actually have a free version for professional use. So if you're a small business, don't want to pay any fees, you can run a twin-gate container professionally, and I think pay nothing. And there's just a whole lot of other applications that are free. Like right now, we have the Resilio Sync app. You could also run a Resilio Sync container for syncing P2P even remotely without any port forwarding needing. It's very cool, but again, it's free for personal use, has a cost for professional use. But if you use Syncthing, does most of the same thing, but it can be free for professional use. So there's so many more things you can do, or there's cost savings you could have, or there's higher degree of security. You just have so many options when there's just so many, like thousands upon thousands of containers you could run in your QNAP NAS, when for applications, it's like 100 apps to choose from. But when you have thousands upon thousands of containers, there's just so many more options. Next question. If I want to set up a container such as Pi-hole via YAML, how does one assign a static IP? So with YAML, yeah, you could do static IP with either YAML or GUI. So I'll have a live demo. So we'll go into static IP in live demo. The next one. To make sure our containers are easy to recreate and are better off putting these on our shares so we can update easier. So I think you're asking how to update a container. So with YAML, I'll go into this. Basically, when you have YAML, you can modify the YAML, and then you technically delete the container and redeploying it. But when you delete a container, there's an option to either delete associated volumes or not delete associated volumes. Now, containers store the data on an associated volume. So if you delete the container but don't delete the volume, it keeps its configuration, and it's technically deleting the container, but it doesn't feel like you're deleting the container. Like it really feels like you're updating the container because your volumes are still there. So if you made a user, your user's still there. If you installed something on it, it's still there. So it's deleting and recreating it doesn't really feel like you're deleting it and recreating it as long as you don't delete the associated volume. So you just modify the YAML and then delete and redeploy the YAML. So before we go into the live demo, usually if the official provider of the container provides YAML, usually that would be a good YAML to use if it's by the official provider of the official container, but it's still on you to check. Ultimately, QNAP cannot verify all YAML from all container providers. We're not willing to take the responsibility to make sure that all YAML everywhere you might use is safe. It is on you ultimately to check. So there's a few things that you could check for. There are things that could be put in YAML that could diminish or remove containerized isolation. So like cap add, net admin. I mean, these are like net admin isn't like that dangerous, but just it means that it's not quite as isolated. Sys module removes isolation. I think it's sysadmin to a greater degree, and unconfined can really undo containerized isolation. So even if it's the official YAML by the official providers of the official container image, it is still on you to check, look at the risks, and if you see some things like sysadmin, it doesn't mean you shouldn't deploy it, but you have to assess the risks and decide, is this isolated enough? It is on you to check YAML, even if it is the official provider of the official container image. So let's get into live demo. Yeah. So first of all, let's make a share folder. So then I'll make a user. Okay. And so now I can edit share folder permissions. Let's give it read-write access to Syncthing. Okay, so the first thing I'll show before even I show Syncthing is the easiest kind of container at all. Anyone who knows almost nothing should be able to make a container from an app template. These are containers where we verify whether just the default settings just work. So let me click on this. I could literally just click next and deploy, just works, but optionally, don't have to do this. Find host path. So I'll connect the public folder. Call it from, so it's the public folder, but internally in the container, show from NAS. And now it's making the container. So this is just a couple clicks. So these are the specific containers where the default settings just work without modification. So anyone who knows pretty much nothing can just click a couple times and they got a container. So those are the very simple ones. So I got my little desktop here. Probably don't need to go too much into detail, but I got a container. So now let's do something just a little bit more complicated, but not too complicated. Containers, explore. So this is a Syncthing container, very similar to Resilio Sync. This can, and also very similar to QSync, but QSync for remote syncing would typically rely on VPN, but this can make a peer-to-peer connection for even remote sync without port forwarding. And it can sync multiple NAS together. It can sync computers. You can sync multiple computers with multiple NAS, a big mesh. So it's pretty cool. And it is free. Now, real quick, I want to show in the GUI, but at the same time, I want to compare it to YAML. Linux Server also provides a version. I like to use the official version instead, but Linux Server provides some YAML. So I just want to, as a comparison, compare the YAML to the GUI so you can see how what in the GUI corresponds to what in YAML. So first of all, look at these ports. In our GUI, the internal container ports just show up, and these ports are just empty. And the most straightforward thing is just copy and paste. The most straightforward thing is use the same external port as internal port, but you are free to change the external ports. And so compared to the YAML, see these ports here? It has internal port, external port, internal port, external port. As you see, it's the same ports. So on YAML, you do it like this, but in the GUI, the ports just show up and you just enter it there. Back to the GUI, advanced settings. If we're going to sync something, we want to connect it to a folder. So storage. I want to bind mount host path to connect to a share folder. The share folder I just made. Pull this from NAS. And this should just work. Now, I do have a few other options. Let's see. Environments. I could add a variable because if you look here, they did put time zone. So optionally, you can add time zone. It's probably a good practice to add time zone, but it should work without time zone. So I'm just gonna deploy this container. So you would run Syncthing on one NAS, Syncthing on another NAS, or you can run Syncthing on a computer. I'm syncing with my home NAS right now. And I'm not going to go through all the configuration, but basically, I will need to add the folder. I think I called the folder I think I said from NAS. So I'm going to go here, storage. So I internally called the folder from NAS. And then you're going to need to add a remote device. So the way you add a remote device on the other device, show ID, copy the ID, close, add remote device, ID. But I'm not going to do everything now. Another thing I'm going to mention is, yeah, I'm not going to demonstrate this now because I need to have two different containers. But that's how you would set it up. And if you have 5 NAS, you can have Syncthing on 5 NAS, plus you can have like 5 or 10, 20 PCs, have everything sync, and it can do P2P for even remote sync without the need for port forwarding. So next, let's talk about Plex. So I could copy paste all these ports, but I'm gonna do something slightly different. I'm gonna go advanced, networks, custom, host. So what host does is it just uses the same network stack as the NAS. So with host, I don't forward ports to my container. It's just whenever you type in this port on the NAS, it goes to the container. If you type that port on the NAS, it goes to the container. I'm using the host network stack with host mode. So that's another option for container. But actually, let me go back real quick because but I'll just do this. And then I realized there was a question. So maybe I should do that. I'll deploy this and I'll do that. Advanced settings, storage. Ideally, I should have, let me just do that. Let me make a multimedia folder because Plex probably wants some kind of media folder. Plex. I'll go back here. Plex. So here's something I want to point out. You can choose read, write, or read only. Whenever you configure a container, really the right philosophy is ask what are the minimum privileges needed to make this container work. And that just adds higher degree of security. So when you have Plex, Plex needs to stream your videos. Plex does not need to write to your videos. Now, Plex does need to write to some config folder because it does make metadata. It has to write its metadata. So with this way, has read-write access to some internal config folder that has no user data and read-only access to your videos. And that way, even if Plex were to get hacked, what can the hacker do? They can screw up your config folder, but they can't screw up your video. So if they screw up your config folder, what do? You delete the Plex container, redeploy the context Plex container, remix the metadata, not a big deal, because you give it read-only access to your folder with video. So this, I think, illustrates how containers should be set up and how you can give them a higher degree of security. This container does not have access to other NAS folders. It has read-only access in this case to your folder with videos. Now there is something else we need to add is Plex claim for this to work. Variable. Here I have my YAML here. Let me make sure I do the right syntax for the Plex claim. Sometimes if you're not sure the right syntax, I do sometimes just do this. Or you could also get the YAML provided as well. So here goes, Plex claim, all caps. And you need a value. So how do you get that? So you go here and it'll give you the Plex claim. I don't really want to publicly show everyone how to claim my Plex account, but if I go here, it will generate a token, a claim token. And then I will put that claim token here, and then that will connect this Plex container to my Plex account. So if I don't do that, the Plex container runs but won't connect to my Plex account. So that's what you do, add the token, and then it should work. So I just need to, since this is host mode, it won't show the port there, but the Plex port. I guess 32400. So just NAS IP and 32400. And I may need to type web. Yeah, I gotta choose /web. Interesting. It might actually let me sign in without even putting my Plex claim ID. Nice. So Plex claim ID can more directly connect it to your account, but through signing in, it looks like I could still get this working. From NAS, right? Because when I made the container, storage, see from NAS was the internal container. So it's Plex folder my QNAP, but from NAS internal container. So you see that from NAS. It's right here. Add. And add light, yeah. I don't think I have any videos in it, but yeah, Plex server is working. And so of course there's the Plex app, but what this is for is a higher degree of security because I want to say, first of all, I think Plex has done a great job on security. So nothing bad on Plex, but the philosophy of creating containers is you want to create it in such a way where even if the container got hacked or compromised, your host system should be okay. So even if you believe that the creator of that app makes a very secure app, just this is the philosophy of containers. Containers configure them so even if they're compromised, your host is okay. So the advantage of Plex container is it doesn't have access to all your folders. It has access just to the one Plex folder. In fact, it's read-only access. So even if it's hacked, a hacker cannot mess up your videos. So that's pretty cool. So that's Plex in GUI. Before I go any further, I think someone had a question on network settings. Was that a network question before? How to adjust network settings? When you use YAML to deploy a container, is there a way to customize the YAML to have a default URL so it doesn't need to be specified on the GUI? So we could use bridge mode, and when you use bridge mode, there's a way to bridge mode does have a way to put static IP. So first of all, let's start in the GUI here. So Plex, edit, network. This one's in host mode, so that's a bad example. Add. So I can add. I could choose Drizzt mode, and I could choose a static IP in the GUI. So that's how you do in the GUI, but the question was specifically how to do a static IP in YAML. So first of all, in YAML, you have to put bridge. Okay. Well, let me get back to you at the end on how to do static IP in YAML. I know at a very basic level, you gotta choose bridge mode, and then you just have to do it. You have to just do an IP address, but let me just get the exact syntax at the end. Are there any more questions so far? Is it possible to run Docker Swarm on several NAS devices? Well, what we do support here is Kubernetes, which isn't, I mean, I think it's at least a similar purpose, right? Kubernetes is for having many containers on many devices managed through Kubernetes. I don't intend to demonstrate Kubernetes today. I think that's a more complicated deployment that I'm prepared for right now. But Kubernetes would be the option for many containers on many NAS. I may ask, would it be possible to demo a NAS device serving as persistent storage to a container running on a server VM? Well, a NAS could be persistent storage for another container. There are ways to map an SMB volume onto a container. That can be done through YAML. Our GUI, I don't think has a way to SMB mount, but there are ways that can be done. That is probably beyond the detail I was planning on going in live demo, but the answer is yes, it actually is doable. You can map SMB shares onto a container. Yes. So when I do Plex YAML, I'll show how to connect the iGPU to Plex for hardware transcoding. So why don't I do that now? So let's do Plex YAML. So if you want to find the YAML for your containers, we store it in our container folder. Oh, right. Container station data app, and then they're just listed by app numbers. So one of my apps is Plex. Should be, I think it's app 7. So here is my YAML. I'm going to use it as a starting point, but I'm going to add dev tree for hardware transcoding. I can't do that on my host NAS because my host NAS does not have Intel QuickSync, but I can use this. And so what you see here for YAML, you have the image. So I'm grabbing the image from Linux server Plex. You can also grab the official image from Plex either way. Give it a name. It's up to you what name you want to do. Network mode host, so I use the host stack. I don't have to forward the ports. Environmental variables, TZ is time zone. This is optional. I think it would be English by default anyway, but language English. Host name, Docker Plex. And then these are the share folders on my NAS, but I home NAS, but I will have to modify these to for my other NAS. restart unless stopped. Let's go here. Containers, create application, create can deploy YAML here. I'm just going to get rid of those for now because I'm trying to be quick. Ideally, I would SSH in, get the folder path to like a Plex folder. But I can keep this relative path, and this will make a folder inside a container folder. That should work. But I do need devices dev tree. Here's where I can add devices. Devices dev tree is very picky on spacing. So here we go. Plex, name, host mode, optional parts, devices dev tree. Dev tree is hardware transcoding. I'll add a relative path, but if you do this, you should add a proper path to a share folder, but relative path can still work. So let's make this. What if all the conflict with my other Plex container? Well, let's find out. Let's stop this one. Okay, this is my new container. So this one has hardware transcoding. So that is the question of how to add hardware transcoding. You just have to add dev tree under devices, and that works with Intel QuickSync. If it was NVIDIA, it would be a different code. So NVIDIA is different than Intel QuickSync. You need to have the right device to the right hardware that you have. And if you have different hardware, you will have to look that up, but you add it under devices, and dev tree would be the most common for QNAP. Yes, updating the container image. I did want to show this. Let me just show Nextcloud, because this is a great way to get an image and update it. Need to make some kind of password. Password. Got to change 480 to something else. And now this should work. Now, if I was doing Nextcloud personally, which I did, I preferred to link it to a share folder that we can run snapshots in the share folder. And if you later delete your container, you're less likely to delete the data. There's a lot of reasons to prefer a share folder, but just to get this done real quick, I'm sticking with the internal volume. So I'm going to call this DAN, username, Daniel, new password. I'll delete this when I'm done. Just do something simple like this. And what's cool about this is I'm going to install this. And when I redeploy the container, I won't have to install it again. It's going to install it, and the installation will be on an associated volume, so that if I then delete the container without deleting the volume, still gonna be installed. So install recommended apps. While it's installing, maybe I'll even just demonstrate this on my Plex. So remember I used that relative volume for Plex in the YAML? When you use a relative volume, it appears where the YAML is. So the YAML is here. So, oh yeah, to edit the YAML, you do want to get text edit in the App Center. Okay, let's go back here, YAML. So you see how I did / for relative path? That's relative to where your YAML is. So here I am where the YAML is. Here's the Plex folder. So I could put my videos here and it would work. Now that's probably not the most ideal place, but that's where / goes. So we're going to look at this YAML. Let's say I want to modify it in some way. I could change just about anything. I could then redeploy. This done? Okay, cool. So I'll do this on the Nextcloud now because I think that will be a better demonstration because you saw it had to install. And if I now delete Nextcloud but keep the volumes and redeploy it, I won't have to reinstall it. Okay. Stop. I'll let it actually get the YAML before I delete it. That's going to be important. Okay, copy. Here I'm going to click remove, but I'm not going to click this. I'm not going to remove the associated volumes. I'm just going to remove the container image. And so when I redeploy it, I won't even have to reinstall it, and the username I created will still be there. So let's say I want to make some change. Instead of 8081, let's do 8082. So it's already installed. But one thing about Nextcloud is it has trusted domains with ports. So I actually now have to go to the PHP file Nextcloud and tell it to accept 8082. That's probably beyond the scope of this, but it's already installed. I deleted it, I redeployed it, it's already installed. And once I edit the PHP file, it will let me in, but its security is saying that I changed the port. Here, I'll change the port back. Actions, stop, move. Back to 8081. And I'm in. And notice I did not have to reinstall it. And that's really cool. It's installed. My user I made is there. If I had like changed the background to be there, it doesn't feel like I deleted it, right? But I did delete it, but I did not delete the associated volumes. So that's really how you modify a container is you delete it without deleting the associated volumes. Are there any more questions? I'm new to NAPs and containers, and a lot of the advanced settings you're changing feels like memorizing magic. Where can you access step-by-step instructions for this? Well, when it comes to YAML, you really start with the specific YAML by the particular providers, and then just make the basic changes. And the basic changes are absolute file path you have to change. Internal path, you don't have to change. Relative path, you don't have to change. Absolute file path, you have to change. You can change an absolute file path to a relative file path. That's the easiest way if you don't want to SSH in and get the absolute path. But that's what you absolutely have to do. And then you may have to change the port if your NAS is already using that port. And I mentioned that in the slides that I went through. So this will be recorded. You can go through the slides again, and it'll just basically tell you how to recognize what's an absolute path, relative path, internal volume, and just absolute path you have to change. And ports that are already used, you have to change. Otherwise, you can usually just use the YAML that is provided. And so that allows you to deploy a lot there because there's a whole lot of containers where the YAML is provided. And then really simple containers like Syncthing, I mean, you just use the default ports and add a NAS folder, and that should work. So a lot of these are simple. And then for some more advanced ones, you do have to look some things up. Like I knew for Plex hardware transcoding I had to add dev-dree, but I had forgotten the exact syntax, so I asked GPT. Like when I know what I want to do basically, but I forget the exact syntax, I do ask my AI. I find AI is pretty good about exact syntax a lot of times. Like for Plex claim, does it have to be all caps? What if you forget? Like I want to add Plex claim, what's the exact syntax? I do sometimes ask my AI for that. And I find syntax questions is pretty good. So if that said, I think that is all for now. And I want to say thank you for watching, and they'll be recording. And of course, if you have more questions, feel free to send us an email, contact us, and we can go into more detail and maybe some questions I couldn't go in as much detail today.
Thank you, Daniel. So if there's no further questions, thank you all for joining our webinar. We'll be posting this webinar on our QNAP College YouTube channel. You'll be also receiving a follow-up email if you have your email registered with us in this webinar. And you will have a link to play back this video if you wanted to get more questions. And then you can always send us an email at ussales@qnap.com. Be on a lookout for another email that we send out for next month's webinar. So we host these events every month. Thank you all for joining.